go back to the dock.
No.
Take that off before the cameras get here. Dana Pierce stood beneath the white lights of the Phoenix Distribution Gala, one hand gripping Nolan's lapel, the other pinching the crimson vendor seal above his freight clerk badge. Executives and reporters gathered outside the boardroom. Nolan kept his hands at his sides. Dana, leave it. She tore the seal free. The fabric snapped. The crimson disc struck the floor, spun once, and stopped near a cameraman's shoe. Dana glanced at the watching executives and smiled. He forgets where he belongs when there's an audience. Freight entrance is downstairs, Nolan. Go back before someone mistakes you for part of the merger team. Consultant Adrian Vale hid his amusement behind a champagne glass. His merger proposal would close 2 warehouses, outsource freight operations, and erase nearly 300 jobs before winter. Workers had been promised stability. For 6 weeks, Nolan had loaded pallets, checked vendor routes, and listened to workers describe what those jobs kept alive. His simple questions had earned careful lies. Now Dana wanted him out of sight before the final vote. Nolan bent and retrieved the crimson seal. Its pin was twisted a thread from his jacket caught around it. Dana leaned closer. Do not embarrass me today. The deadline closes at 5, and Adrian has worked too hard for you to wander into the wrong room. I'm not the one who should fear the wrong room. Her smile vanished for half a second. Then the board secretary opened the doors and called the voting members inside. Dana recovered. You are not a voting member. Nolan slipped the damaged seal into his pocket. No, he said. I'm the reason some of them can vote at all. Inside, a giant screen displayed the merger logo above 4 silver words, One Network, One Future. Warehouse employees stood along the rear wall invited for photographs, not answers. Dana took the head chair. Adrian sat at her right, though he held no office in the company. A leather folder rested before him, thick with projections and thin on human cost. The clock read 3:42 p.m. The vote had to clear before 5. Dana spoke of courage and growth, praising Adrian without mentioning the fortune his firm would collect if the deal closed. When the labor slide appeared, the projected layoffs flashed on screen for barely 3 seconds. A mechanic beside Nolan whispered, "Did that say 286? Across the room, Dana noticed. Is there a problem in the back? Every face turned toward the freight clerk with the torn jacket. Dana expected silence. So did the executives. The room had been trained to expect it from a man wearing a warehouse badge. Instead, he walked toward the table. Dana's voice hardened. Security. Nolan stopped beside Evelyn Shaw, the board secretary responsible for preserving the official voting record. He removed a sealed document and placed it before her. Not before Dana. Not before Adrian. Before the keeper of the record. Evelyn read the first line. Her pen froze. Adrian's fingers stopped tapping against his folder. Dana pushed back from the table. What is that? Nolan rested 2 fingers on the document. The merger control memo you were told no longer mattered. The room changed, not loudly, not yet. But the workers saw Dana's expression and the directors saw Adrian pull his folder closer. Evelyn continued reading. Her eyes moved toward Nolan's pocket where the edge of the crimson seal showed against the torn fabric. Mr. Pierce, she said carefully, are you asserting the vendor block? Dana laughed too quickly. He cannot assert anything. He is a freight clerk. Nolan met her gaze. Then, this should be easy to disprove. He placed a thinner supporting record beside the memo. Audrian rose so fast his chair struck the glass wall. Dana did not look at Nolan now. She looked at Adrian. And the man, selling everyone a brighter future, suddenly seemed desperate to leave before the vote began. To understand why a freight clerk could stop a merger. Why Dana feared a damaged crimson seal and why Adrian's hidden fee was about to put him out. We have to go back 6 weeks before the gala, before the torn jacket, and before Nolan Pierce decided silence was no longer protecting anyone. 6 weeks earlier, Nolan Pierce reported to the West Freight Dock at 5:10 every morning. Phoenix was still dark, then the desert sky carrying a thin violet line above the warehouses. By noon, the loading yard would shimmer with heat, but before sunrise it belonged to forklift. Beeps, diesel engines, and workers too tired to waste words. Nolan wore the same gray work shirt as everyone else. The only unusual thing was the crimson vendor seal pinned beneath his plastic freight badge. Most people assumed it was an old union token or a family keepsake. Nolan never corrected them. He checked incoming pallets, matched seals to manifests, and listened. That was why he had taken the clerk position. From a glass office above the dock, executives saw labor percentages and route efficiencies. At ground level, Nolan saw Mateo counting overtime hours because his daughter needed braces. He saw Linda hiding an ice pack beneath her sleeve because she could not afford to miss another shift. He saw men in their 60s lifting freight that should have required 2 people. They did not know he was measuring the company from the inside. They knew him as the quiet man who brought coffee when the night crew ran late and fixed paperwork without making anyone feel stupid. At 44, Nolan had learned that dignity was often protected in small ways. His silence, however, had a cost. Every evening he drove 20 minutes north to the modest stucco house he still shared with Dana. The marriage had not ended, at least not on paper. It had simply narrowed into separate rooms, separate meals, and carefully managed appearances at company events. Dana was the public CEO of Pierce Meridian Distribution. Nolan was the husband she rarely mentioned. Years earlier, they had built the business together from 2 leased trucks and a rented storage unit. Dana had been fearless with customers. Nolan had handled vendors' contracts and the patient work of keeping control from slipping away. Then Nolan's father died. The old man had founded the original vendor cooperative that gave Pierce Meridian its first roots. Before his death, he placed the cooperative's voting interests into a family trust and gave Nolan the crimson seal representing its controlling vendor block. It was not jewelry. It was authority. But after the funeral, Nolan stepped back from daily leadership to care for his mother through her final illness. Dana moved into the visible role. Over time, the company began speaking of her as if she had built it alone. Nolan let the story stand. At first, he called it grief. Later, he called it peace. By the time he understood that silence had become permission, Dana had surrounded herself with people who treated him like an inconvenient relative. The worst of them was Adrian Vale. Adrian arrived as a strategy consultant with polished shoes, expensive restraint, and an answer for every problem that required someone else to lose a job. He spoke about consolidation. Nolan heard closures. He spoke about vendor simplification. Nolan heard control moving away from the family trust. He spoke about personal alignment with Dana in tones that made several employees suddenly busy whenever Nolan entered a room. Nolan did not confront either of them. Not yet. He wanted facts stronger than suspicion. One evening, Dana came home after 10 and found him repairing the crimson seal at the kitchen table. The clasp had loosened during a shift. She dropped her keys into a ceramic bowl. "You still wear that thing? It identifies the vendor trust. It identifies the past." Nolan pressed the clasp closed with a pair of needle-nose pliers. The past still owns 34% of the voting supply agreements. Dana opened the refrigerator without answering. On the counter beside her purse sat a thick presentation binder stamped with Adrian's consulting logo. Nolan could see only the title page. "Meridian Stratus Consolidation. You're moving fast," he said. "The market is moving fast. How many warehouses close?" Dana shut the refrigerator door. "You are not involved in executive planning. I'm still involved in ownership." Her shoulders tightened. Then she gave him the patient expression she used with employees she had already decided to replace. "The trust has not exercised control in years. The board understands who actually runs the company." Nolan placed the seal in his palm. "That is not the same as who can bind it." Dana's phone lit up with Adrian's name. She turned the screen face down. "The vote is in 6 weeks," she said. "The transaction deadline closes the same day. Please do not make this difficult because you feel left behind." Nolan could have answered with anger. Instead, he asked one question. "What happens to the dock crews?" Dana picked up her binder. "Growth always requires adjustment." The next morning, Nolan returned to freight. He began asking drivers whether routes were being redirected. He compared vendor codes on pallets and watched unfamiliar subcontractors inspect loading bays. He noted which managers had been told to prepare redundancy models. The danger showed itself in fragments. A maintenance order was canceled at the Mesa warehouse. Temporary labor contracts appeared at a cheaper Nevada operator. 2 longtime vendors were told their agreements might not renew after the merger. Then Mateo found Nolan near the time clock. "Boss, sorry, Nolan." Nolan noticed the slip but let it pass. Mateo lowered his voice. "People are saying West Freight closes by Christmas. You hear anything?" "Nothing official. My wife is expecting. I cannot lose insurance in December." Nolan glanced across the dock. 37 workers moved beneath the fluorescent lights, unaware that somewhere above them their lives had already become a savings estimate. "I'll find out," he said. That promise changed the nature of his silence. That night, Nolan opened the locked drawer in his study and removed the family trust file. Inside was a copy of the original vendor agreement, the Crimson Seal registry, and one reference to a document he had not seen in years. Merger Control Memorandum. The memorandum was not in the drawer. According to the index, the controlling copy had been placed with the corporate record keeper whenever a transaction threatened vendor voting rights. Nolan read the line twice. Then he checked the calendar. The merger vote was 6 weeks away. At 5 o'clock that same day, the deal would become binding. For years, Nolan had believed staying quiet protected his family from another fight. Now he understood that silence might cost hundreds of other families their work. He pinned the Crimson Seal back onto his freight shirt the next morning. This time, it no longer felt like a memory. It felt like a warning. By the third week, the merger had become less a proposal than a performance. Dana appeared in local business magazines beneath headlines about bold leadership. At employee meetings, she spoke about protecting the company's future, while Adrian stood just outside the camera frame feeding her numbers and phrases. "I was always close enough to influence the room and far enough to avoid responsibility." To senior managers, Adrian was the man who could make Pierce Meridian attractive to investors. To warehouse crews, he was the reason every ordinary expense had suddenly become a threat. Broken dock lights remained unfixed. Overtime approvals disappeared. Safety requests were returned with the same stamped phrase, "Deferred pending consolidation review." Dana called it discipline. Nolan called it preparation. The company's internal policy required freight staff to remain in operational areas unless summoned upstairs. It had once been a practical safety rule. Dana began using it as a wall. When Nolan entered the administrative floor to ask about vendor renewals, her assistant stopped him beside the elevators. "Freight employees need an appointment. I'm here regarding trust-controlled contracts. Mrs. Pierce said all questions should go through your shift manager. My shift manager doesn't administer the trust." The assistant's smile stayed fixed. "Then I suggest you send an email." Nolan did. No one answered. 3 days later, 2 long-term vendors arrived at West Freight and discovered their access codes no longer worked. One of them, Sam Ortiz, had supplied refrigerated transport since Nolan's father was alive. His company employed 22 drivers and had never missed a delivery window. A security guard met him at the gate. "Your authorization is suspended." "On whose order?" "Corporate procurement." Sam called Nolan from the visitor lane. When Nolan reached him, Sam was standing beside his truck with a printed notice folded in one fist. "They say my contract is being reassessed for overlap," he said. We signed a 5-year renewal last spring." Nolan read the notice. The vendor identification line had been altered. Sam's trust-linked code had been replaced by a temporary procurement number, stripping it of the protections attached to the original agreement. "Did you approve this change?" Nolan asked. "I didn't know there was a change." Nolan photographed the notice and the disabled badge. It was a small injustice by corporate standards. To Sam, it meant 22 families might lose their income. Nolan took the issue to Dana during an executive walkthrough at the warehouse. Cameras followed her as she inspected a newly painted loading lane. Adrian moved beside her discussing automation savings while workers had been ordered to keep the area clear. Nolan waited until the photographer lowered his camera. Sam Ortiz was locked out this morning. Dana continued walking. Procurement is reviewing duplicate vendors. His code was changed without consent. Then procurement will correct it if necessary. The change removed his trust protection. Adrian answered before she could. That category is obsolete. Nolan's attention settled on him. Under which authority? Adrian's smile thinned. Modern supply networks cannot be held hostage by ceremonial arrangements. The Crimson Seal rested against Nolan's work shirt. Adrian glanced at it, and for a moment his confidence slipped. Then Dana noticed the nearby employees listening. She raised her voice. "Nolan, this is exactly why operational workers should not involve themselves in executive decisions." A forklift driver stopped writing on his inspection sheet. Dana continued. "You see one familiar vendor and imagine a crisis. We have an entire company to protect." Nolan held out the altered notice. "Then explain why the original code was removed." She did not take it. Instead, she addressed the workers. "Change can make people emotional. Please trust the people qualified to evaluate it." Adrian gave Nolan a sympathetic nod, the kind reserved for someone unable to understand his own limitations. The cameras began flashing again. Within an hour, the company intranet posted photographs of Dana standing among the crews under the caption, "Leadership Listens." Sam's truck was still outside the gate. That afternoon, Nolan found the first clear trace of what Dana and Adrian were trying to bury. A revised vendor master list had been left open on a receiving terminal. Most of the codes meant nothing to the clerks, but Nolan had helped design the original system. He recognized the pattern immediately. Trust-protected vendors were being recoded one by one. On paper, they were no longer part of a unified voting bloc. Individually, none held enough power to challenge the merger. Together, they did. Nolan printed only the page showing Sam's altered entry and placed it inside his locker. It was not enough to prove intent, but it confirmed the system was being changed before the vote. When he returned to the terminal, Adrian was waiting. "You have an unusual interest in procurement data for a freight clerk. I have an interest in accurate records. That can become an expensive habit." Adrian kept his voice low, almost friendly. "The merger will happen. Dana understands that. The board understands it. Even the vendors will understand once they see the final numbers. And the warehouse workers, they will receive whatever the agreement requires. That isn't what I asked." Adrian adjusted one cuff. "You still think this company owes people permanence? It doesn't. Companies survive by choosing who remains useful." Nolan studied him. "And who decides that?" "The people with control." Adrian walked away before Nolan could answer. The irony might have been amusing if the consequences had not been so serious. That evening, Dana hosted a donor reception at a downtown hotel. Nolan was expected to attend as her husband, though his name appeared nowhere on the program. When he arrived in a dark suit, the crimson seal pinned discreetly inside his lapel, Dana intercepted him near the ballroom doors. "Why are you here? You asked me to come. I asked you before you started challenging Adrian in front of employees. I asked about a falsified vendor code." Her hand tightened around her glass. "Lower your voice. I'm speaking quietly. That has never stopped you from making things difficult." Across the lobby, Adrian laughed with two board members. Dana followed Nolan's gaze and shifted between them. It was not affection Nolan saw in her expression. It was dependence. Adrian had convinced her that the merger would make her untouchable. He had also convinced her that Nolan's remaining authority was symbolic, old, and too embarrassing to acknowledge. "Stay away from the board," she said. "Stay away from procurement. And stop wearing that seal to company events. It belongs at company events. It belongs in a drawer with the rest of your father's relics." Nolan's voice dropped. "My father built the vendor system keeping this company alive. And I built the company people respect." There it was. Not merely ambition. Fear. Dana could not tolerate anything that reminded the room her power had limits. The next morning, Nolan discovered his access to vendor files had been revoked. By noon, his shift manager handed him a disciplinary warning for leaving the freight area without authorization. By 3, Sam Ortiz had been told his contract would expire on merger day. Nolan signed the warning only to acknowledge receipt. Beneath his name, he wrote "Vendor record alteration disputed. Formal review requested." The shift manager stared at the sentence. "Dana told me to keep this simple." It stopped being simple when someone changed the record. Nolan took his copy and walked back onto the dock. He could have left. His ownership interest would survive even if the warehouse did not. He had enough savings to start again somewhere else. Mateo caught him near Bay 7. "My wife's doctor moved the delivery date up," he said. "They say the baby may come early." Nolan saw the fear behind his attempt to smile. "If these jobs go before December..." He did not finish. Nolan did not need him to. That was why walking away was no longer an option. He touched the crimson seal beneath his shirt, then opened the disciplinary notice once more. At the bottom, Dana's office had added a line he had not noticed. Any further violation would result in immediate removal from company property, including attendance at the merger vote. They were not merely humiliating him. They were trying to keep him away from the record. Nolan began with the official path. He submitted a written request for the merger control memorandum to corporate records citing the family trust and the altered vendor codes. Evelyn Shaw, the board secretary, replied the same afternoon. The memorandum existed. Access required confirmation from either the CEO or outside counsel. Dana denied it within 11 minutes. Her response contained one sentence. Your claimed authority is not relevant to the pending transaction. Nolan printed the email and folded it into his pocket. The first dismissal had been clean documented and useful. I went next to the person responsible for the vendor master list. Procurement Director Helen Cho had worked at Pierce Meridian for 14 years. She knew Nolan from the early days when he still negotiated routes from a folding table inside the original warehouse. Now she met him in a glass conference room and kept both hands around a cup she never drank from. I cannot discuss merger preparation. I'm not asking about projections. I'm asking who authorized the recoding. Helen's gaze moved toward the security camera above the door. The system update came through Adrian's integration team. Under whose signature? I was told executive authorization had been verified. Did you see it? Her silence answered. Nolan slid Sam Ortiz's altered notice across the table. If these vendors were separated to weaken the trust block, the vote could be challenged. Helen pushed the paper back. I have 2 children in college. Nolan understood the rest. So do the people whose contracts are being erased. Her voice dropped. Do not make me choose in this room. He gathered the notice. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking you to preserve the original record. Helen finally met his eyes. Then the conference room door opened. Dana entered with Adrian behind her. You were warned, she said. Nolan remained seated. I requested clarification from procurement. You pressured an employee who reports to me. I asked who changed a vendor code. Adrian placed a hand on the back of Dana's chair, familiar enough to be noticed, and practiced enough to appear accidental. Nolan has been struggling with the transition, he said. Dana accepted the explanation as if he had offered it for her benefit. She placed a second disciplinary form on the table. Effective, immediately you are reassigned to night receiving. No administrative access, no contact with vendors except through dispatch. The reassignment cut him off from the people most likely to notice further alterations. It also removed the daytime overtime that had been helping him cover the remaining mortgage on the house. Nolan read the form. Dana watched for anger. He signed only the receipt line again. You always do that, she said. Do what? Act calm so everyone else looks unreasonable. Adrian's expression shifted with quiet satisfaction. Dana leaned over the table. You are not protecting workers. You are punishing me because the company moved on without you. For a moment, the accusation landed where she intended. Nolan remembered hospital room's funeral arrangements and the years he had surrendered without asking what would remain when grief was finished with him. Then he noticed Helen's reflection in the glass wall. She was listening. This is not about whether the company moved on, he said. It is about whether you moved its control without authority. Dana straightened. Escort him back to freight. The personal humiliation spread faster than any official notice. By the time Nolan reached the dock, workers had heard that he had been removed from the executive floor for disrupting procurement. Some avoided him. Others watched with sympathy they were afraid to show. Mateo found a new schedule posted beside the time clock. His name had been moved to a temporary status list. What does provisional placement mean? Nolan read the small print. Benefits eligibility subject to merger staffing review. It means they can delay a decision until after the vote. My wife goes into the hospital next week. Mateo's voice cracked on the final word. Nolan took a photograph of the schedule. That evening, the practical threat reached his own home. Dana had placed a property valuation packet on the kitchen counter. We should sell before the merger closes, she said. This house is half mine, and half tied to a life neither of us is living. Nolan opened the packet. A proposed listing agreement marked the property for immediate sale. You already contacted an agent. I'm planning responsibly. For whom? Dana folded her arms. If you interfere with the vote, the board will remove you from every remaining company role. Adrian says the trust challenge could expose us to litigation. Adrian says a lot for someone who does not own a share. He understands the transaction better than you do. Understands what he earns from it. Dana's face hardened. Be careful. There was the warning, not denial. Nolan closed the packet. I will not sign. The next morning night, receiving supervisor Carl Benton handed Nolan a list of pallets that had arrived from the Nevada operator Adrian favored. 3 carried new vendor numbers. 1 carried an old trust code beneath a replacement label. Nolan peeled back only enough to read the original identifier. It belonged to a vendor supposedly removed for duplication. Someone had not eliminated the vendor. They had hidden it inside the new system. Carl glanced toward the office. You didn't get this from me. Did anyone photograph the receiving label before it was covered? Warehouse scanner did automatically. Where do those images go? Compliance archive, 90-day retention. That was the quiet active step Nolan needed. He did not copy the image or break access rules. He submitted a preservation request through the company's own compliance portal, identifying the shipment and stating that the label might relate to a disputed vendor record. The request generated an automatic confirmation number. A small thing, but it placed the original code inside a system Adrian's team could not quietly erase without leaving another trace. By noon, Nolan received a call from Evelyn Shaw. Your preservation request triggered a board record alert. That was the intention. You understand this may be viewed as escalation. It is escalation. Evelyn paused. The merger memorandum you requested is referenced in the trust index, but Dana's counsel argues it expired after the last restructuring. Was it formally revoked? I cannot answer that without authorization. Who controls the original? The board record office. You do. Another silence. I preserve the record, Evelyn said. I do not interpret it. I'm not asking you to interpret it. I'm asking you not to let anyone remove it before the vote. Her voice grew quieter. Why would anyone remove it? Nolan glanced at the photographed schedule showing Mateo's benefits at risk. Because if it still controls the vendor block, the merger cannot pass in its current form. Evelyn ended the call without promising anything. That afternoon, Adrian appeared on the dock holding the preservation notice. I had misread Nolan's move. You think a shipping label proves fraud? No. Then withdraw the request. No. Adrian smiled. You are building a case from clerical errors because you cannot accept what Dana has become. Nolan wiped dust from his hands. The label is not the case. Then, what is? The reason you need it gone. Adrian's smile disappeared. He moved closer, lowering his voice beneath the machinery. Dana will choose the merger. The board will choose the merger. Your employees will take severance and move on. You can either preserve what is left of your marriage or lose that too. Nolan felt the temptation to strike back with everything he suspected. Instead, he asked the question that mattered. What percentage is your closing fee? Adrian's eyes shifted. Only once. But it was enough. That night, Nolan reviewed the public merger summary and found the consulting compensation buried inside a broad transaction cost line. It did not state Adrian's personal fee. The detail was hidden elsewhere. The supporting record, whatever form it took, would have to connect him directly to the deal. Nolan still had no access to it, no guaranteed place at the vote, and no certainty that the control memorandum remained valid. At 4:26 p.m. his phone rang. Helen Cho spoke before he could say hello. I preserved the original vendor master file. Nolan sat upright. Thank you. Do not thank me. Just listen. Adrian's team requested an overwrite scheduled for merger day at noon. Does the original show the trust-linked codes? All of them. That file could confirm the manipulation, but it was not the supporting record he needed for Adrian's fee. Helen inhaled sharply. There is something else. I saw a payment description on the integration schedule. It was routed through the transaction ledger. Then you send it. No, I cannot remove company data. Then don't. What are you going to do? Nolan thought of Evelyn Shaw, the person controlling the official record. I thought of the compliance alert and the approaching deadline. I'm going to force the question into a room where they have to answer it. The next morning, a gala invitation appeared on every executive's calendar. Distribution celebration. Final merger vote to follow. Nolan's name had been removed from the attendee list. At the bottom of the notice was a direct instruction from Dana's office. Freight personnel are to remain below during all media activity. Nolan printed the page and placed it beside the preservation confirmation. They had mistaken restricted access for surrender. By the end of the day, he had made his decision. He would not sneak into the gala. He would not leak accusations. He would take the trust index, the preservation number, and his formal request directly to Evelyn Shaw before the record closed. If Dana wanted him removed, she would have to do it in public. And if the merger memorandum still carried the authority his father had protected, the next person forced out would not be a freight clerk. By gala afternoon, Pierce Meridian's main warehouse no longer looked like a place where freight moved. White curtains hid the loading equipment. Silver tables covered the marked concrete. A temporary stage stood beneath a banner celebrating the merger, while employees in clean uniforms were arranged along the walls as proof of company unity. The cameras were scheduled for 3:30. The board vote would begin 12 minutes later. At 5, the transaction deadline closed. Nolan arrived through the freight entrance wearing his gray work shirt beneath a dark jacket. The crimson vendor seal rested above his badge, repaired, but still carrying a faint scratch across its face. In one hand, he held the trust index and the preservation confirmation. In the other, nothing. I had no copy of the merger control memorandum, no transaction ledger, no guarantee Evelyn Shaw would place either into the record, only a right to ask and a room full of people determined to stop him. Carl Benton intercepted him near Bay 4. Dana sent security down twice asking whether you were on shift. I am. She said you're not to go upstairs. I'm not going upstairs. Nolan's attention moved toward the glass boardroom built above the converted event floor. I'm going into the room they brought downstairs. Carl followed his gaze. You sure about this? No. It was the honest answer. A man could know what had to be done and still feel the weight of what it might cost. Across the floor, Mateo stood beside his wife, Elena. Her pregnancy was visible beneath a pale blue dress and one hand remained pressed against the small of her back. Dana had invited spouses for the photographs. The company wanted families in the frame while preparing to cut their insurance. Mateo came over quickly. They made us sign a release saying we support the transition. Did you sign? They said we couldn't attend otherwise. Nolan studied the workers positioned beneath the merger banner. That is not support. What happens after today? I don't know. Mateo searched his face. But you found something. I found enough to ask the right question. Before Mateo could answer, the public relations director called everyone into position. Dana entered through the administrative doors with Adrian beside her. They moved through the crowd as a pair, receiving applause from managers and polite smiles from workers. Dana wore white. Adrian wore navy and carried the same leather folder Nolan had seen in the merger presentations. When Dana saw Nolan, her pace faltered. Adrian whispered something. She handed him her champagne, then crossed the floor. You were given a direct instruction. I was assigned to freight. This is freight. Do not play games with me. Nolan raised the folder in his hand. I requested access to the controlling record. Evelyn has not responded. She has no reason to. The board decides that. The board is not going to entertain a grievance from an employee under discipline. This is a trust matter. Dana glanced toward the nearest camera crew. Her anger sharpened into calculation. Take that seal off before the cameras get here. Nolan did not move. She seized his lapel. The moment unfolded as it had in the flash forward. The pin tore free. The crimson disc struck the floor, and Dana ordered him back downstairs as though his presence might contaminate the celebration. But this time, the wound cut deeper. Mateo's wife flinched. Several workers lowered their eyes. Dana had not merely humiliated Nolan. She had shown every employee what happened to anyone who challenged the version of reality she controlled. Then she faced the crowd. Unfortunately, some people are having difficulty separating personal disappointment from the company's future. Adrian watched Nolan retrieve the damaged seal. His expression held no surprise. He had expected Dana to do exactly this. Nolan rose. Dana continued loud enough for the cameras now gathering near the stage. My husband has been struggling since stepping away from leadership years ago. We have tried to give him meaningful work and privacy, but today he chose disruption. The word husband moved through the employees in whispers. Many had never known. Adrian lifted his champagne with a solemn expression, playing the concerned advisor. Dana pointed toward the freight corridor. Security will escort him out. The practical threat was no longer a reassignment. It was removal from the vote. 2 guards approached both men Nolan knew by name. He did not resist them. Instead, he held the preservation confirmation toward Dana. A vendor record scheduled for overwrite was preserved yesterday. She did not take the paper. Adrian answered from behind her. A routine system conversion. The original codes show the trust block remained unified. That is your interpretation. Then open the record. Adrian's voice cooled. This event is not a hearing. No, Nolan said. The vote is. One of the guards touched his arm. Before Nolan could move, Dana crossed another line. She gestured toward Mateo and the employees beneath the banner. This is exactly the instability the merger prevents. People who refuse structure put every family here at risk. Mateo's jaw tightened. Nolan saw Elena grip his sleeve. Dana was using their fear against them while calling herself their protector. Then she delivered the cut designed to force surrender. If Nolan continues this spectacle, I will authorize an immediate operational shutdown of West Freight pending review. A murmur passed through the crew. The warehouse itself had become leverage. Mateo's benefits. Sam Ortiz's drivers. Every household depending on Friday's paycheck. Dana held Nolan's gaze. Walk out now and the shift continues. Keep going, and everyone here can thank you for what happens next. Adrian lowered his glass. He believed the choice was impossible. Fight and hurt the workers. Surrender and let the merger erase them later. Nolan felt the room pressing for an answer. Some faces pleaded with him to stop. Others pleaded without words for him not to. His own marriage stood across from him wearing the expression of a stranger. He thought of the house Dana wanted sold the years they had built something together and the possibility that exposing the record would end whatever remained between them. Then Elena shifted uncomfortably. Mateo placed a hand beneath her elbow. That small movement settled the question. Nolan had spent years mistaking the absence of conflict for the preservation of family. But silence that left other families undefended was not peace. He placed the torn crimson seal in his pocket. Evelyn Shaw controls the board record, he said. I am requesting a formal determination before any vote is counted. Dana's face flushed. You are requesting nothing. Remove him. The guards began guiding Nolan toward the corridor. He went calmly. Adrian relaxed and whispered to Dana. She moved toward the stage where the press lights blinked on and the merger presentation began. Nolan had nearly reached the freight doors when a voice carried across the floor. Mr. Pierce. Evelyn Shaw stood at the boardroom entrance holding a sealed archival envelope. Beside her was Helen Cho. Helen carried no papers, but her company badge had been removed from its lanyard and clenched in one hand. Evelyn descended the short steps slowly. Your preservation request has been entered into the official record. Dana left the stage. Evelyn, this is not the time. It is the only time, Evelyn replied. The transaction deadline makes postponement material. Adrian moved between them. The request concerns a shipping label. It has no bearing on board authority. Evelyn held up the envelope. The label triggered review of the archived vendor classification. Dana's voice dropped. I told you the memorandum was expired. You told me council believed it was expired. I am the CEO. And I preserve the board's governing records. The room's attention shifted away from Dana. That loss of focus frightened her more than Nolan's accusation ever had. Evelyn approached the board table and placed the archival envelope at its center. The red wax mark across its flap carried the same emblem as Nolan's damaged seal. One director rose halfway from his chair. Adrian's hand closed around his leather folder. Nolan saw the movement. So did Helen. She spoke from the rear of the room. Before the vote, the board should also review the transaction ledger entry attached to Mr. Vale's integration fee. Adrian spun toward her. Dana's face emptied. The first undeniable sign had arrived. Not the full truth. Not yet. But enough for every person in the warehouse to understand that Nolan had not walked into the gala seeking attention. He had walked in because someone had built the merger on a record they never expected anyone to open. Dana reached for the archival envelope. Evelyn Shaw placed one hand over it. Until the board determines relevance, this remains under record control. You work for this company, Dana said. I work for the integrity of its record. Adrian stepped forward with the calm expression he used when presenting bad news as expertise. This is unnecessary theater. The vendor memorandum predates 2 restructurings and has no legal effect on today's transaction. Nolan remained near the freight doors, one security guard still beside him. Then read it. Adrian ignored him. He addressed the directors instead. An archived document raised by a disciplined warehouse employee should not delay a merger of this scale. Helen Cho's voice came from the back. I is not only a warehouse employee. Dana cut across her. His old title is irrelevant. Helen did not retreat. I was referring to the vendor registry. A chair scraped at the board table. Director Martin Webb, who chaired the audit committee, raised a hand. Enough. Evelyn opened the envelope. Dana's eyes moved toward Martin. We agreed this vote would conclude before the market deadline. We agreed to vote on an authorized transaction. Evelyn broke the wax mark. Inside was a 12-page memorandum yellowed slightly at the edges but preserved beneath a clear archival cover. A crimson emblem appeared beside the title. Merger Control Memorandum, Pierce Vendor Trust. Adrian gave a small dismissive laugh. A ceremonial instrument. Evelyn read silently for several seconds, then passed the memorandum to Martin. Dana folded her arms. Can we stop pretending an old family arrangement outranks the current board? Martin did not answer. His finger moved down the page until it reached a paragraph marked in the margin with the same seal Nolan carried. Then he read aloud, "Any consolidation sale merger or transfer materially reducing trust. Protected vendor rights requires affirmative consent of the registered vendor block before corporate approval may become effective." No one spoke. Adrian recovered first. That provision was superseded when the company reorganized. "Where is the revocation?" Nolan asked. Dana faced him. "You do not get to interrogate my advisor." Nolan's voice remained even. "I asked about the record." Martin continued reading. "The memorandum remains binding unless revoked by written consent of the controlling partner and entered into the permanent board register." He lifted his eyes. "Evelyn, is there a revocation?" "I searched the permanent register, the restructuring archive, and the outside counsel index, and there is none." Adrian opened his leather folder. "Absence from the archive does not establish continued validity. We have legal analyses supporting the restructuring position." Nolan watched him remove a prepared opinion summary. "You brought an argument against a document you said did not matter." Adrian's hand paused. "The workers along the wall understood the contradiction before several directors did." Dana approached the table. "Nolan has spent weeks manufacturing suspicion. He accessed information outside his role, harassed procurement, and disrupted operations. This is personal retaliation." Martin glanced at Nolan's torn lapel. "Is he the registered controlling partner?" Evelyn checked the final page of the memorandum. "The authority attaches to the holder identified in the trust registry." "And who is identified?" Evelyn looked across the room. "Nolan James Pierce." A silence changed texture. The freight clerk, standing beside security, had not inherited a decorative symbol. He held the controlling position Dana had trained everyone to dismiss. She shook her head. "The registry is outdated." Nolan withdrew from leadership. "I withdrew from management," Nolan said. "I never transferred ownership." "You abandoned the company." "I cared for my mother, and I kept this place alive." "That does not give you the right to rewrite control." Dana's face tightened with years of resentment. "You disappeared when everything depended on me. Now you walk in wearing a warehouse badge and expect the room to kneel because your father left you a seal." Nolan took the damaged emblem from his pocket. "No one needs to kneel." He placed it on the board table. "They need to follow the agreement." Martin examined the seal number against the registry page. The numbers matched. Dana turned toward Evelyn. "He cannot stop the merger alone. The vendor codes were reorganized. There is no unified block left to assert." That was the argument Adrian had built the transaction around. Break the vendors into separate classifications and Nolan's authority would appear to control nothing. Adrian closed his folder. "At most, the memorandum creates a consent right over the original vendor group. That group no longer exists." Helen moved forward. "It existed until your integration team changed the codes." Adrian's tone sharpened. "You have no proof of improper alteration. The original master file was preserved before the scheduled overwrite." She placed her badge on the table. "I supervised the procurement database for 14 years. Every trust-protected vendor remained linked under the original classification. The replacement codes were added during merger preparation without signed vendor consent." Dana stared at her. "You are suspended." Martin raised a hand. "No employment action will be taken against a witness while the audit committee is reviewing this matter." Dana's mouth remained open for a moment, but the order had moved beyond her. Evelyn entered Nolan's compliance confirmation number into the board terminal. The preserved record appeared on the large screen. On the left were the original vendor codes. On the right were the replacement numbers. 21 trust-protected vendors had been separated across unrelated classifications. Sam Ortiz's company was among them. A director near the screen leaned forward. These changes were all entered by the same integration account. Helen nodded. "Created for Adrian Vale's team." Adrian tapped the table. "Administrative recoding is not fraud. The vendors remained operationally intact." "Then, why schedule the original file for overwrite before the vote?" Nolan asked. "It was routine cleanup. The same day the control block would be questioned." "You are implying criminal conduct without understanding data migration." "I'm identifying timing." Adrian appealed to Dana. "This is exactly why unqualified people should not control complex transactions." Nolan did not raise his voice. "Show the board your fee." The room's attention shifted again. Adrian gave a weary smile. My compensation is disclosed in the transaction costs. Your firm's compensation is. Dana moved between them. This has nothing to do with vendor authority. Helen answered. It has everything to do with why the authority was hidden. Evelyn opened a second record on the terminal one preserved through the transaction ledger. Adrian reached toward the keyboard. Martin blocked him. Sit down. For the first time, Adrian did not immediately obey. Then, two directors rose from their chairs and he lowered himself slowly. The ledger appeared on screen. A consulting fee of $1.8 million was listed under Vale Strategic Integration. Beneath it was a contingent payment note. Adrian Vale personally receives an additional $640,000 upon closing, payable only if the transaction becomes binding before 5:10 p.m. The mechanic beside Nolan whispered a curse. Mateo stared at the screen as though the number belonged to another language. Dana, read it twice. You told me the incentive went to your firm. It does. That says personally. It is standard partner compensation. You said you had no direct financial conflict. I said the fee did not affect my recommendation. Nolan watched Dana realize what Adrian had done. He had tied his personal payment to the deadline. The layoffs accelerated the savings projection. The vendor recoding removed the only block capable of stopping him. And Dana had used her authority, her marriage, and the workers' fear to carry his plan across the finish line. Still, she tried to regain control. This changes nothing about the strategic value of the merger. Martin closed the opinion summary Adrian had prepared. It changes whether the board received independent advice. Another director spoke, and whether the voting structure was manipulated. Adrian rose again. There was no manipulation. Dana approved the integration process. Every face moved toward her. The defense was not loyalty. It was distance. Dana understood too late that Adrian was placing the decisions on her. You designed the recoding, she said. My team implemented an executive-approved plan. You told me the trust had no authority. I provided an interpretation. You promised the board would never see that memorandum. The words escaped before she could stop them. No one needed another confession. Nolan picked up the control memo and carried it to Evelyn. This was the moment he could have allowed anger to speak for him. Instead, he addressed the person preserving the vote. I am asserting the registered vendor block under the memorandum. I withhold consent to the merger in its current form. Evelyn entered the statement into the official record. Martin closed the merger ballot packet. Without vendor consent, this transaction cannot become effective. Dana gripped the back of her chair. You cannot cancel months of work because Nolan wants revenge. Nolan faced her. I did not stop this because of what you did to me. His gaze moved toward Mateo, Elena, and the crews along the wall. I stopped it because you planned to make families pay for a deal built on a hidden fee and an altered record. The clock read 4:18 p.m. 42 minutes remained before the deadline. It no longer mattered. Martin announced an emergency review. The merger contract was frozen pending outside counsel's examination. Adrian's consulting access was revoked immediately, and security was instructed to preserve his company devices and escort him from the property. Adrian protested that his firm would sue. No one followed him when he left. Dana remained at the head of the table, but she no longer controlled the meeting. The audit committee suspended her authority over procurement, vendor records, and merger matters, pending investigation. An interim operating panel would protect payroll benefits and warehouse operations while the review continued. West Freight would not close. The temporary staffing changes were frozen. Sam Ortiz's access was restored before the evening shift. Mateo lowered his head and covered his face with one hand. Elena held him against her shoulder. Nolan did not celebrate. He returned the memorandum to Evelyn, then lifted the crimson seal from the table. Its pin was still bent. Dana watched him fasten it imperfectly above the tear in his jacket. For weeks, she had treated that seal as evidence of a man living in the past. Now the entire room knew it represented the one promise Adrian's merger could not, by bury or rewrite. The gala decorations came down before midnight. By morning, the white curtains had been removed from the loading equipment, the merger banner was folded into a storage cart, and West Freight sounded like itself again. Forklifts crossed the concrete. Dispatch radios crackled. Workers who had spent weeks waiting for bad news returned to ordinary problems: late trucks, damaged pallets, missing signatures. For once, ordinary felt generous. Outside counsel arrived that afternoon. The board opened a formal review into the altered vendor classifications, Adrian's contingent payment, and Dana's role in approving the integration plan. The frozen transaction remained under legal examination, but no vote could proceed without Nolan's consent and a corrected vendor record. Adrian's firm terminated his assignment before the week ended. His personal closing payment disappeared with the merger deadline. The company also demanded the return of consulting fees tied to work the audit committee believed had been improperly disclosed. Whether further penalties would follow was left to lawyers and regulators. There was no dramatic arrest in the warehouse, no instant courtroom victory. Only a man who had expected to collect $640,000 being escorted from the building with his access badge disabled and his reputation placed under investigation. Dana remained on administrative leave. The board did not erase her years of work, but it no longer accepted her version of those years without question. She had built relationships, won contracts, and expanded the company. She had also hidden a controlling document, allowed vendor records to be changed, and threatened employees to silence the person challenging her. Real accountability held both truths at once. 3 days after the vote, Nolan found her in the kitchen packing files into a cardboard box. The property listing agreement remained on the counter unsigned. Dana placed a framed photograph inside the box. It showed them standing beside their first 2 delivery trucks, both younger, exhausted, and smiling as though hard work could protect them from everything. "You made me look like a criminal," she said. Nolan stood near the doorway. "I opened the record. You knew what would happen. I knew what might happen if I stayed quiet." Dana sealed the box. "You chose those workers over our marriage." He considered the accusation carefully. "No, I chose not to use our marriage as an excuse to abandon them." Her eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall. "Adrian lied to me. Yes, you could have warned me differently. I tried." She glanced toward the dark screen of her phone. For years, every difficult conversation between them had ended with one person leaving before the truth became too uncomfortable. This time Nolan stayed. "So what happens now?" she asked. "The investigation happens. I mean to us." Nolan touched the repaired seal beneath his jacket. "I don't know. It was not forgiveness. It was not revenge. It was the only honest answer he had." They agreed to separate while the review continued. The house would not be sold until both had independent counsel and enough time to decide without the merger hanging over them. Nolan did not ask the board for Dana's office. I did not take her CEO title. Instead, he accepted a temporary seat on the operating panel representing vendor and warehouse interests. His first request was simple. No employee would lose pay, health coverage, or seniority because of the frozen merger. The board approved it unanimously. Mateo's temporary status was corrected the next morning. His benefits remained active when Elena went into labor 2 weeks early. Their daughter was born healthy. Mateo sent Nolan a photograph from the hospital, a tiny sleeping face wrapped in a white blanket, one hand closed around her father's finger. Beneath it he wrote only, "She got here. We're covered. Thank you." Nolan read the message alone in his truck before his shift. That was the moment the victory became real. Not when Adrian lost access. Not when Dana lost control of the room. When a frightened father no longer had to choose between a hospital bill and a paycheck. Sam Ortiz and the other protected vendors received corrected contracts. The original classifications were restored and future changes required direct written consent from each vendor and review by the audit committee. Helen Cho returned after the board determined that preserving the master file had protected the company from a compromised vote. She was promoted to oversee vendor record compliance, though she insisted her new office remain near the warehouse floor. Evelyn Shaw revised the board procedures so no executive could block access to a governing document by personal instruction alone. The institution changed because people had finally seen how easily a rule could become a weapon when everyone was afraid to question it. 6 months later, Nolan was still arriving before sunrise. Ha no longer worked every freight shift, but he kept one morning each week on the dock. Some directors thought it unnecessary. Nolan believed anyone voting on warehouse jobs should occasionally stand where those jobs were performed. One cool November morning, he helped Mateo inspect a damaged shipment near Bay 7. The crimson vendor seal was pinned to Nolan's work jacket. Its surface had been polished, but the scratch Dana left across it remained visible. Mateo nodded toward it. "You could replace that." "I could." "Why don't you?" Nolan ran a thumb across the mark. Because repaired isn't the same as ruined. The sun rose beyond the Phoenix loading yard, turning the warehouse roofs copper and gold. Trucks waited at the gates. Inside, hundreds of people began another ordinary workday. Nolan watched the first trailer pull toward the dock and thought about the years he had spent believing dignity meant enduring humiliation without reaction. I understood it differently now. Dignity was not silence. It was knowing when to speak, bringing proof instead of rage, and refusing to let someone else's power decide whose family mattered. Dana had torn the seal from his jacket because she thought ownership belonged to the person commanding the room. Nolan had put it back on because ownership meant responsibility for the people who had no command at all. When power humiliates someone publicly, do you think staying quiet protects peace or only protects the person doing the harm? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who chose dignity when silence would have been easier.